Hello, welcome to our lecture number 4 now. We're going to be taking a look at um, methodology in psychology, and we're going to be taking a look at some important distinctions between basic and applied science, and then moving on to these tactics, methods that psychologists use in order to do the science that we do. So we have a lot that we want to cover. So let's get right into it. There's a very important distinction that I want to make sure everybody understands before we start taking a look at these methods for collecting information, and that is the distinction between basic research and applied research. And I think that it's all summarized very good right here. You know, when we're taking a look at basic research, we're really talking about acquiring knowledge for its own sake. We're interested in discovery. We don't really care whether or not that information that we acquire from that research is going to have any real world importance. We want to know how something ticks. Applied research, on the other hand, is, we're really interested in solutions, solutions to problems. We're interested in practical solutions for problems. And indeed, sometimes psychologists practice just basic research, sometimes just applied. Sometimes it's a mixture of the two. But I think the single most important thing that you need to understand is that basic research is really about, acquiring knowledge for just because we're interested, just because we're curious. We don't know whether or not it's going to be used for anything ultimately. Maybe tomorrow it could be useful, but maybe 100 years or 200 years from now it could be useful for something. But we just want to know how something works. Applied research, on the other hand, we're taking findings of basic researchers, and we want to use those findings to accomplish a particular goal. So that distinction is important, because a significant amount of what we talk about, and is what is in your textbook, is really about basic research that psychologists have performed. Yes, we're interested in application, but we're interested really in understanding basically, what our behavior is a product of and what the factors are that go into controlling our behavior. And yes, that information oftentimes is very useful immediately, but oftentimes it is not. So with that in mind, let me give you a couple of examples of basic and applied research in psychology. I want you to pretend for a few moments that you're a developmental psychologist. You're interested in visual processing, let's say. You want to know when visual processing begins. You want to know how sophisticated it is in young infants. One of the things that you do as a researcher, you construct an experiment where you take a look at preferences that infants have. Let's say a 2-month-old infant, like what you see here. And you expose them to objects that are of different colors, different shapes, different sizes. And you use what we call gaze time. That is how much time the infant spends actually looking at those objects as a measure of their interest. And one of the things that you find, for example, is that objects that have 5 sides that are approximately 8 inches in diameter and of the color red are much preferred over objects of different sizes, different shapes, different colors. What you do when you write up that research and publish it in a psychology journal is you talk about the linkages of the preferences to the development of the visual system itself, and what is happening in terms of receptors in the eye, and what is happening in terms of the connections that are being made in the brain and that are developing at this period of time during infancy. Now, that work probably doesn't have any real world importance at that particular time, except telling us about the development of the visual system and preferences for colors and shapes and sizes. But consider a psychologist who is more interested in application. Take, for example, a psychologist that's employed by a toy company. Maybe it's one of the large toy companies like Mattel Toys, for example. And they read about the research that you've conducted. They begin thinking about helping their company that they're employed by to construct a toy that is going to be of those qualities, that is the size, the color, the shape, in order to develop a crib toy that ultimately could sell millions and millions of dollars. This is an example of an individual who is really very interested in application. And indeed, note the distinction between the two. One psychologist interested in basic research, how something works, how the visual system is working, and an applied psychologist who wants to take those findings and use it to accomplish some kind of a practical goal, in this case, the development of a toy that's going to make their company millions of dollars. Let me give you yet another example. Let's take a psychologist, a social psychologist, who's studying how friends form in a large company. Who likes who, how much, what are the qualities of those individuals that seem to attract others or not attract others in terms of friendships that ultimately develop. And they do a very extensive analysis on let's say, a medium-sized company in an urban area in order to understand this. Now, there's a person that's interested in just how those friendships form, and they're not interested really in the productivity of the company and the implication of those findings in terms of the productivity of the company. I mean, there may be some individuals there that have no friends at all, or individuals who have so many friends that they don't get anything done over the course of the day. They would not report that to the company. They're just interested in how those friendships are forming. But let's take a look at a psychologist who is interested in application, like an industrial organizational psychologist, who actually might try to rectify that office situation based upon the findings of that basic researcher in order to improve the productivity of that company. So again, that's a person that's interested in applied research. So again, note the distinction, between the two, and that's an important distinction in the field of psychology that you will notice more and more as you go along and you read, and we have more lectures in this particular field. Take a look at this very interesting study. We will talk about it later on when we get to the whole area really of development. But this was a study that was done by a psychologist in the 1950s out in the Midwest by the name of Wayne Dennis. And what he did was to study infants that were being raised in a very impoverished orphanage. The study was a very provocative one because the study showed that infants were very seriously impaired in these orphanages in terms of their intellectual development, their physical development, their emotional development, and really they did not have many contacts with adults. The adults that were there were overworked staff members. They didn't really have a lot of toys and exposure to learning experiences. So the results were ones that were very provocative and ones that, when they were reported, really attracted a great deal of attention. The implications of that orphanage study at that time were very interesting ones. The conclusions that were drawn by the media and by experts just absolutely exaggerated those findings of Wayne Dennis, and began making all kinds of recommendations that you should be exposing your kids at a very early age to all kinds of patchwork objects in their room, all kinds of mobiles, and this extraordinary information overload, sensory overload, in order to make sure that your child develops normally. But again, keep in mind that in that orphanage setting, it was a relatively impoverished environment. Kids didn't really have a lot of things that you would want to see them exposed to during that period of time. Their schedules were very regimented. They, slept and played in very cramped quarters. The findings were just grossly exaggerated by a number of books that came out from quote-unquote experts at that time. So, an infant whose family is very poor probably has a heck of a lot more to look at, a heck of a lot more to listen to, a lot more to touch than a child that's being raised in an orphanage setting. So indeed, we have to take those findings with a grain of salt. And one of the things that happens in the media, and I see it all the time, is the findings of basic research are grossly distorted. And one of our goals is to make you a better consumer of psychological science, to the kind of research that psychologists do. And I want to exert caution. One of the things that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take the findings that you read about and start to apply them to yourself and to other individuals, and you need to be very careful about that. This is not simply true in the field of psychology, but it's true in so many other areas of scientific investigation, where we're taking findings and we're really extrapolating way beyond what the actual intent of the scientist. So, scientific methodology is incredibly important in the discipline of psychology. I can't emphasize it enough. We ask a question. We collect data, we test a hypothesis that we have, and we come to a conclusion. And typically what happens is that generates even more ideas and more research and more hypotheses. I think that most people, they are interested in what psychologists have to tell us. But they're not terribly interested in how psychologists go about collecting that information. And quite frankly, how that information is collected is really going to determine the integrity and the importance of that research. So we need to know a little bit about that whole process. So I like to tell students, you really need to view this as being similar to learning, for example, the rules of a football or a basketball game. I've had friends who have come from foreign countries, and I've taken them to basketball games or to football games. And quite frankly, in the case of football, they don't understand what's going on at all. But once I start telling them about some of the rules, and once I tell them about certain guidelines that are used for the playing of the game, they begin to get it and they begin to understand it. The same holds true in terms of the field of psychology and the methods that we use. Indeed, those methods are very important. If we use them inappropriately, they can lead to all kinds of erroneous conclusions. So again, we're going to be spending a little bit of time on this in terms of methodology. So we gather information in psychology in a number of different ways. Social psychologists, for example, use surveys. We're going to talk about surveys. Psychotherapists use case studies. Developmental psychologists use what we call longitudinal cross-sectional studies. Physiological psychologists use what we call, and experimental psychologists use what we call laboratory-based studies. My goal is to give you a little bit of experience with the major data gathering techniques that we have in psychology, and to tell you their strengths and to tell you about their weaknesses. But there's some important methodology and terminology that we have to first understand. For example, when we talk about a sample, A sample is a portion of the total number of individuals that we can select for an experiment. Now, if we were doing a study here in the United States, a country that consists of 360 million people, it's not like we can go and test all of those individuals. Test them in terms of the experiment that we want to do. So we're going to use a portion of those individuals, a sample, a part of the total number of individuals. A representative sample, a sample that is of sufficient size to reflect what we call the universe of all possible individuals. The larger our sample, the greater that sample is going to reflect all individuals. And indeed, there are ways of mathematically testing how large our sample should actually be. A random sample, a sample in which every single person in the universe of relevant individuals has an equal chance of being selected. This eliminates bias, and indeed an incredibly important part of any experiment that we conduct is to make sure that we're not biasing our results because we have too small of a sample, that we have a sample that does not reflect the universe of all possible individuals. I like to try to give some examples to help you to understand this. For example, if I was interested in exploring maybe attitudes individuals had about legalization of marijuana, and I just, let's say I was in Texas, in San Antonio, and there's a beautiful Riverwalk area there in downtown San Antonio, and I, over the course of let's say the lunch hour, 12 to 1 o'clock, I stopped as many people as I could and asked them the question, do you think that marijuana should be legalized or not? Yes or no. And let's say I had maybe 30 individuals that I was able to answer that question for me over that period of time. And what they said for the most part was that they were interested in the legalization of marijuana. Not an unimportant question, certainly. But think about that group of 30 individuals. Many of them were individuals who were living in a relatively urban environment. Many of those individuals were probably adult individuals. Many of those individuals were probably perhaps of Hispanic origin. Many of those individuals, given that area, were probably Catholic. Many of those individuals were individuals that you could probably describe as being upper middle income individuals. Again, predominantly from an urban environment. Does that sample of individuals reflect the universe of all possible individuals? And the answer, of course, is no, because our sample is too small, because our sample really wasn't one that was randomly selected, that the sample is biased. And we would not want to base any kind of conclusions upon that kind of a sample. So that's why we use a random sample. Again, promoting, let's talk about another study in which we're trying to understand whether the learning of math in young school children can be achieved more successfully through constant reward and reinforcement. It's a very interesting study, and in fact, a study that was done right here in Albany County a number of years ago, a long time ago, but it was a very interesting study that was done. So here's what they did. They took a random sample selected of fourth grade students in Albany County. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with Albany County is very diverse. You can drive from the center of the city of Albany, maybe 10, 15 minutes away and be in complete wilderness. It's very much represented in terms of a variety of different cultural backgrounds. It's very much represented in terms of, urban, rural, and suburban environments. It's very much represented by a range of different socioeconomic conditions, including income. If we took all of those fourth grade children, again, in every single school in Albany County, public and private, and we wrote down on a piece of paper the names of those individuals. Let's say there were 10,000 individuals. And so there's 10,000 pieces of paper. Each one has a different name on it, and we put it in a hat, like what you see here, and then we drew them out one at a time. And let's say that we took 200 students that were randomly drawn from that hat. And in their school situations, again in the fourth grade, they were constantly praised for their performance in terms of learning basic mathematical principles. And the other 200 students the names that we drew out of this hat, they instead were exposed to a condition in which they were not given constant praise by their teachers. What they found in this study is that those who were rewarded learned a lot better and retained those math principles for a much longer period of time. It's a very interesting study. But would you stop there? I don't think so. What you would do is you might say, well, what does this look like in other parts of the country? What does this look like in the South? What does this look like in the Midwest? What does this look like in the North? What does this look like in the West? What does it look like in vastly different demographic areas? Well, indeed, what these scientists did was they duplicated this very same study in a variety of different situations, in a variety of different regions of the country, in a variety of different counties, some of which were urban, some of which were rural, some of which were suburban. And generally what they found was that the results that were found in Albany County really generalized to other places. So that was a very important finding. And indeed, the point that I want to get to is this. The discipline of psychology, again, what we call psychological science, is really about this building block, this replication. This is a pyramid, okay, in Egypt, built by a series of these blocks. And eventually we get up to the top here, but it takes a very, very long period of time. And what I want to emphasize to you is that science, psychology, mathematics, physics, biology, chemistry, replication is crucial. We would not want to accept the results of a single study. We instead would want to have a variety of studies that use the same methodology, but perhaps are conducted in very different situations, okay, in very different environments. We would want to be able to duplicate our work. So again, it's like the building of a pyramid in terms of the acquisition of knowledge, and the importance of that knowledge is critically dependent upon replication, critically dependent upon duplication. So let's talk about some of these data collection techniques. We're going to talk about case studies, what we call naturalistic observations, surveys, cross-cultural comparisons, longitudinal cross-sectional studies, laboratory-based experiments. And the point that I want to make with all of these methods, we're going to be taking a look at pluses and minuses, meaning we're going to be taking a look at strengths and weaknesses. The point that I want to make is a very important message. None of these are perfect. They all have flaws, and I'm going to be pointing out those flaws to you with the examples, by way of the examples that I give you. So let's, again, understand that this is an imperfect world in terms of science. We are constantly striving in order to be able to have very reliable and valid conclusions to our studies, but none of these ways of collecting information is a perfect way. Let's first take a look at what's called the case study. Here's Sigmund Freud. He's going to crop up a number of times over the course of this semester, but he was one who used what's called the case study. And what a case study is it's a very intense investigation of just a few individuals, maybe 3, 4, 5 individuals. And we're studying them in terms of a single psychological phenomena. And to give you an example of what Freud did, he was studying hysteria. And what hysteria is it's this paralysis that occurs in individuals. It's unexplained, it occurs very suddenly. When these individuals are studied medically, complete physical examinations, nothing can be found to be wrong with them. And again, it was Freud who believed that it was related to some kind of an early trauma in their life. These were, very interesting studies, but they were ones that were only done upon a few individuals. So we have this in-depth examination. We know everything about these individuals. We know everything about their medical history. We know everything about their family history, everything about their work history. We just gather as much information as we possibly can. But the question becomes this: because the sample is so small, is it possible for us to really say that this is something that can generalize to many individuals? Would we say, for example, that 6 individuals where we found that they all experienced some kind of a trauma, emotional trauma during early life, would we say necessarily that this is something that can extrapolate to all individuals? Well, this is not a controlled study. This is what we would call a retrospective study. We're not controlling the backgrounds of these individuals at all. We don't really know whether or not this was a causative factor. The only way we can do that is to do an actual experiment, which would be impossible in this kind of a situation. So those results don't really help us to understand cause and effect. But case studies are done all the time, and they're very helpful. Very helpful in terms of generating hypotheses in which we can actually do experiments and hold everything else constant except one, and allow that one thing to change. So again, an important way of collecting information, but it is not a technique that really allows us to make cause and effect kinds of conclusions. Here's another interesting technique: naturalistic observations. Studying behavior in its natural habitat is something that those in the field of animal behavior have been doing for a very long period of time. And the cardinal rule in that, in a naturalistic observation, is don't interfere with what's going on. Jane Goodall, you may be familiar with this very prominent scientist, animal behaviorist, made observations on primates in various parts of Africa. For years, she's still doing it, written extensively about it. Take a look at a very interesting thing that happened to her after about 20 years of studying this one troop of baboons in one part of Kenya. In those days, when she was doing that research, they would set up a field camp that would be near where those baboons lived. They would travel maybe, a mile or so to the field site from their camp. And then they would simply set up in various areas around where they could see these baboons. And they would take notes. They would write down notes of what they observed. Now in this day and age, we videotape a lot of this. But at the time that she was doing it, it was very different. I didn't have laptops, for example, and so day after day they do this, 7 days a week. They're there observing these animals, and then one day, after doing this for 20 years, they go out there to observe and write down their observations. They're gone, and they can't figure out what's happened. And indeed, it could be due to a lot of different things. It could be due to the fact that maybe the food supply was greatly diminished, so they moved on to another territory. It may be that there were some predators in the area, so they moved on. It may be that perhaps the most dominant, what we call alpha males, caught wind of the fact that there were a lot of young females in the adjacent territory, so that they could mate with them. So everybody went with them. Could be a lot of different reasons, couldn't it? But we would not really know for sure what happened. And that's because we had absolutely no control over the situation. Naturalistic observations help us to understand behavior as it naturally occurs, but you cannot determine cause and effect. You cannot determine what a behavioral change is due to, like in the case of these baboons that just suddenly left. You just don't really know why. So indeed, naturalistic observations used in psychology all the time. For example, developmental psychologists studying young children might look through what's called a one-way mirror. Where there's some young children that are playing, and the children don't really know that they're being observed because it just looks like a mirror to them. But a psychologist on the other end would be taking notes about what they observe, or maybe even videotaping those children. Maybe when a situation that occurs when there are new children that are introduced to the room, what is the reaction not only of those new children, but of the children that were already in the room and had made friends with each other. Again, this is a naturalistic observation. It's used all the time in the field of developmental psychology. It's used all the time in terms of assessing animal behavior. It's a very powerful technique, but it can't help us really to determine cause and effect. Okay. Another tactic is surveys. I think we've all been exposed to surveys at one point or another where, for example, someone calls you on the phone, asks you some questions, or you stopped on the street, maybe ask some questions or fill out a survey, or maybe more typically now in terms of usage of computer surveys that you're asked to fill out all the time. It occurs in a variety of different contexts, and again, they can be written or they can be oral. Very famous survey from a number of years ago was Kinsey's, Alfred Kinsey, the sex researcher, in which he surveyed the sexual attitudes of adults, both males and females. Very, very famous survey. Let me tell you about another famous survey, the Literary Digest, a survey that was done prior to the 1936 presidential election. Alf Landon, the Republican, running up against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. And the Literary Digest polled its subscribers and asked them, who do you think is going to win the election? Is it going to be Alf Landon, the Republican, or Roosevelt? Well, by an overwhelming majority, the respondents, again, all subscribers of the Literary Digest, said that they felt Alf Landon would win. And of course, if you take a look at what happened in that year, if you're a student of presidential elections, you know that Roosevelt won by one of the biggest margins, an absolute landslide. What happened to this survey? Why was it so different from what actually happened? Think about this for a few moments. Individuals that subscribe to the Literary Digest tend to be conservative Republicans. Okay. To me, that says it all. The survey went wrong because the sample was not a randomly selected sample that reflected the universe of all possible individuals. So surveys are powerful. They're really important in terms of in many different areas of science, but the samples used have to be random, and they have to be representative of the universe of all possible individuals. That survey was hopelessly biased. Yes, it told us about what subscribers thought to the Literary Digest, but that represents a biased population of individuals. So again, surveys very powerful, but at the same time, we have to understand that they can be terribly, terribly biased based upon the sample that is used. Cross-cultural comparisons. This is another very powerful technique that is used to compare the behavior of people who are in dramatically different cultures and in different parts of the world. Certainly the most famous of these cross-cultural comparisons was one that was done by the very famous anthropologist Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead, you see here in the book that she wrote, Coming of Age in Samoa, where she compared the behavior of Samoan people with those here in the United States. And she found, for example, that Samoans were much more cooperative society. They were ones in which competition was not something that was very characteristic. They cooperated with one another. Sexual attitudes were very open. Contrast that with the United States, where sexual attitudes tend to be repressed, where individuals are intensely competitive with one another. This is a very interesting comparison. And again, what we're trying to do in the field of psychology is to generate information where we say, hey, yeah, this does reflect what happens throughout the world, or it does not reflect what happens throughout the world. You know, cross-cultural comparisons help us to establish whether or not the factors that we think control behavior can generalize to people from many, many different backgrounds. And those cross-cultural comparisons, I think, are becoming increasingly important in our world as we become more and more globally interconnected with one another. What are the flaws of cross-cultural comparisons? Well, it takes a lot of time. And it takes a lot of resources and cooperation with individuals in other countries in order to do these studies. They are very, very time intensive, very expensive to do. But they are so important, especially in this day and age. They've become much, much more important than ever before as we become more interconnected. So the whole field of cross-cultural psychology has become more and more important. But again, drawbacks, enormous amount of time, enormous number of resources in order to be able to do these kinds of studies and do them effectively. Longitudinal, what we call longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. We're examining how behavior changes with age. How fundamental can that be? I mean, those are very critically important studies. Let me tell you about one of the most famous longitudinal studies that has been done. It was something that was called the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study. You simply see the acronym often, WLS. It examined the behavior and attitudes of 15,000 Wisconsin residents every 5 years. It starts way back in 1957 when those individuals graduated from high school. It is a study that is still going on, by the way, although most of the individuals now have dropped out for one reason or another. It's a fascinating study. And this longitudinal study is one of many that have been done in the area of psychology to examine many different aspects of behavior and attitude change that occurs over the lifespan. Longitudinal studies are incredibly expensive to conduct. They take a very long time to complete. And again, as I noted to you in the WLS, the individuals drop out along the way. They die, or maybe the researchers can't contact them anymore. They lose them somehow, and subjects are dropping out. And at those later ages, you begin to say, well, how representative are these people at, let's say, the age of 60 to all individuals that are 60 years of age? You know, you have so many individuals that have dropped out for one reason or another. So oftentimes these are studies that are conducted in association with which is called a cross-sectional study or assessment. Here, what we would do is we would select, let's say, 15,000 people, you know, every 5 years, a separate group of 15,000 every 5 years. What we theoretically we could do is we could do this over a very short span of time. You could do it all in 1 year, for example. You'd have individuals, let's say, at 20 years of age, another group at 25 years of age, another group at 30 years of age, another group at 35 years of age, and so on. You would just collect them all at one time, and you would assess them with your you know, your study of their behavior and their attitudes. But again, this is all being done with separate samples, not just one sample of 15,000 individuals being studied every 5 years, but instead 15,000 at 20 years of age, 15,000 at 25 years of age, 15,000 at 30 years of age, 15,000 at 35 years of age, and so on, which is a study you could do over a relatively short period of time. So longitudinal studies are really important, but they're incredibly expensive and they can take a very long time. And that is why oftentimes what we see is that they are also done in association or in conjunction with a cross-sectional study. Another way of collecting information in psychology is by virtue of what we would call laboratory-based study. And these are studies that obviously we do with human beings, we can do with animals. We use laboratory-based studies all the time. In a laboratory-based study, we want to be able to hold all variables constant, except one, and we call that the treatment variable. We're going to allow that to systematically change, but we're going to hold everything else constant. And in a study of this nature, we're observing the effects of this treatment variable on behavioral responses. Now, I'm going to be giving you examples of what we're talking about here. But what I first want to do is to make sure that you understand what a variable is. A variable is anything that's capable of changing. And if you take a look, for example, at the environment that you're in, maybe at this particular time, you know, the lighting can change, the humidity can change, the number of people in the room can change, the amount of noise in the room. This is a variable. It's anything that can change. And we have two types of variables in a laboratory-based experiment. One variable we call the independent variable. That variable an experimenter can allow to systematically change. He's going to keep all other variables constant. That's what we call the independent variable. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the experimenter, this is what he expects will change. In psychology, typically the dependent variable is behavioral responses. Okay, so again, two types of variables, independent variable and dependent variable. So take a look at this simple example that I have here. The independent variable in this experiment right here, an experiment in which we're examining the effects of a particular fertilizer on the growth of a plant. You know, some of these plants are going to be exposed to this independent variable, the fertilizer, and some are not going to be exposed to the fertilizer. The dependent variable is the growth of the plant, the number of leaves that it produces, the number of fruits that are produced. This is the dependent variable. So I tell students you really have to look at this as an if-then conditional statement. If I manipulate X, which X in this case is presence or absence of fertilizer, then I'll observe an effect upon the dependent variable, which could be the plant growth, the number of leaves, the number of fruits, and so on. Right? So with that in mind, again, understanding this relationship, independent variable and dependent variable. When we take a look at a laboratory-based experiment, we also talk about what we call the experimental group. That's the group of randomly selected subjects that are exposed to the experimental treatment. In the previous experiment that I talked about, it's the number of plants that are exposed to that experimental treatment. That's our experimental group. Our control group is, again, randomly selected subjects. They're exposed in a manner identical to that experimental group to all the same things, with the exception of one, and that is the treatment. And go back to our fertilizer experiment, our control group is not being exposed to the fertilizer. So indeed, experimental group, control group, independent variables, and dependent variables. So take a look at this very simple experiment here. Excuse me, here we have a situation where these are students that are taking a test. This is our control group, and our experimental group is a group of subjects that are also taking a test, but there's this loud band that's playing behind them, and we're going to take a look at the performance of these individuals as a consequence of, excuse me, of the a noise that they are exposed to. So again, independent variable. What's the independent variable? Well, it's the noise that's being produced. In this case, the experimental group, no noise here. That's the one thing that's changing. Everything else is constant. How the subjects were selected, the composition of the subjects, and so on, what their backgrounds are, everything. Just the one thing that's different is the experimental group is being exposed to this noise. So again, that's in a nutshell, laboratory-based experiment. And I like to give, an example of this. Let's say you are examining the effects of a psychoactive, the psychoactive component of marijuana, which is called THC, on the sexual behavior of mice. Here's how you might go about doing this study. You would take animals. These are what are called C57 black 6J mice, male mice. They've been reared in the laboratory setting. They've all been exposed to the same kind of environment, the same kind of cages that measure 6.5 by 11.5 by 8 inches. They all have on the top of their cage a stainless steel wire grid on them. They're all exposed to the same food, Purina laboratory mouse chow. They're all exposed to the same kind of bedding that's on the floor, these sanitized chips that are changed every 2 days. They're all exposed to the same water, tap water, a bottle that's placed on the cage and refreshed every day. They're all exposed to the same schedule of light and dark, that 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark, comes on at 7 a.m. in the morning, goes off at 7 p.m. Again, they're identical to one another. They're genetically identical to one another. The environment that they've been reared in and exposed to is identical to one another. And at 60 days of age, what we're going to do is we're going to put these animals all into their own cage, again, a separate cage, and we're going to inject them with the psychoactive component of marijuana, which is called THC, at a dose that's similar to, let's say, smoking 2 joints over a 2-hour period of time in the case of a human male. And we're going to explore what happens in terms of their sexual behavior when we take a female mouse that's sexually active and place it into their cage. And we're going to measure the amount of time that it takes the male to mount the female, the number of mounts the male exhibits, the number of intromissions that the male exhibits, the length of time to intromit, and then the number of ejaculations and the length of time to ejaculate. And again, some of the animals are going to be randomly selected to be given this THC by picking them up, holding them by the nape of the neck, and then putting syringe in their mouth in which we deposit the THC, which they then swallow, and other control animals are going to be exposed to just the what's called the vehicle, which in this case is an oily substance which is called sesame oil that's used in order to dissolve the THC. So they're exposed to that. That has no THC in it. And then again, we examine them for their sexual activity towards a female. This is a study that was actually done. It was done by a group that I was associated with, and it was done primarily because there were many findings that started to crop up, case studies of individuals that had smoked marijuana and showed a diminishment in their sexual arousal. So here is, what was found in this found in this study is that the males that were exposed to the THC generally didn't show very much sexual behavior at all. Indeed, further studies showed that the dosage was important, that the amount of prior sexual experience was important, that indeed the studies could be replicated in other strains of mice, some more sensitive to it than others. Again, these are all different variables that potentially could be studied. And indeed, this helped us a great deal to understand the effects of THC on sexual behavior. And one of the things that happens is that it tends to disrupt what is happening with the very important sexual arousal hormone, which is called testosterone. Impacts it in the brain, also impacts how it's released from the testes in the male. But notice that this experiment that I described to you is one in which we really can determine cause and effect. We really can determine. We say conclusion of the study is that THC causes a reduction in sexual behavior. It's a result that is very reliable. It's a result that many scientists have now found. It is a result that, again, in this pyramid building in terms of knowledge is important because we're exploring the impact in a variety of other situations, manipulating other variables, like previous sexual history, like the amount of social experience that an animal has had in the past, like the age of the animal, and so on. This is important because this helps us to build the story of the impact that this has upon behavior. So cause and effect, can be determined. That's why we do experiments, whether it's with humans or with animals, in which we have independent variables and dependent variables, in which we have experimental groups and control groups. So clearly, the experimental group here is the animals that received the THC. The control group is the animals that did not receive the THC but were treated identically. The independent variable is, the presence or absence of the THC. And the dependent variable is the sexual behaviors that are seen in male mice, their frequency and their duration. Again, we can determine cause and effect in this particular study. The disadvantage is this. In the case of a laboratory-based experiment, again, whether you're doing it with humans or animals, the situation may be so over-controlled that it has no relationship at all to an organism in its natural habitat. In the particular study that I noted to you, there were other studies that were done in the wild where animals were exposed to THC, and they found very similar results. Again, cause and effect, we can determine. We got to be careful. And we have to be careful because the situation that we may be studying may be, too over-controlled. So when you take a look at natural kinds of behaviors that we see in an organism in its natural habitat, the kind of results that we get might be very different. But The last message that I want to give you here is a critically important one. Psychologists prefer to do controlled experiments, not just psychologists, biologists, chemists, physicists. We want to determine cause and effect. Okay, that is our goal, and laboratory-based experiments really the only way of doing this. So again, the only real way of reliably determining cause and effect is by way of a laboratory-based experiment. Right? So when you take a look at these other techniques that psychologists use that we've talked about, there are advantages and there are disadvantages, but the preference really is in terms of utilizing controlled experiments. So let's end this lecture here, and we'll get on into some other important methods in psychology in our next lecture.